Hi everyone, welcome to ANTH A101 Introduction to Anthropology. I'm your professor, Adam Dunstan. This first module is called The Lens of Anthropology. What is anthropology? What the heck did I even sign up for? And why should I care? Because I think you should care. I think this is more than just a GR. I think this can be a really valuable course for everybody, so I'd like to talk a little bit about why I think so. And I think a good way to introduce that is this way, by pointing out that we all make assumptions about people. We make assumptions about people in general. So, for example, the fact that we have things like fishing regulations about how many fish we can take during the fishing season here in Alaska, and the fact that we need to record this, and the fact that a wildlife agent could stop us if we're violating the laws, these are all reflections of the fact that we assume, or at least it's a widespread assumption, that people, if left to their own devices, may not or will not manage how many fish they take, right? Which relates to kind of a broader assumption about human beings that will overuse resources if left to our own devices, unless there are rules set in place. Of course, there's also a more optimistic assumption here that goes into things like these fish permits where we record the fish, which is that, people will generally speaking be honest, particularly if there's a concern that a ranger might stop you, but that people would generally report their catch honestly. So there's both some optimistic and maybe more pessimistic assumptions going on here, but there's definitely assumptions we're making about human nature. So if I say to you, like, what do we think about human nature? And you're thinking, oh geez, this guy's getting all philosophical on me and it's only the first module. But in reality, human nature is something we all think about every day, right? When we make assumptions about human beings, people are afraid of death. People are selfish. People are good. People are generous. When we think about things like that or make statements like that, we're making assumptions about human nature. We also make assumptions about specific people. So for example, we sometimes interact with people from different backgrounds, different communities, perhaps different cultures, and make assumptions about what their behavior means or what their words mean. Sometimes those assumptions are right, sometimes they're really wrong. An example, there was recently a court case in Sweden where a Muslim woman had refused to shake hands with a man at her workplace. Her point of view was she's from a very specific she's from a specific tradition within Islam, where she felt like that was inappropriate to have that kind of contact casually with men in the workplace. She also applied that to women, though. She didn't want to be accused of sort of discriminating by gender. But anyways, a man that she refused to shake hands with took her to court over this because Sweden has some anti-discrimination legislation that you can do that fairly easily. So this was taken to court and adjudicated to court, and it kind of went back and forth, but ultimately was decided in her favor that she was not being discriminatory. But that shows, I think, what one anthropologist likes to call a cross-cultural miscue, when let's assume the best of both parties in this incident. What's going on here is that the person whose hand wasn't shaked, he made some assumptions, right, about the woman in this case, that she was being rude. He says it felt very insulting, very degrading. He's making some assumptions about what it means to not shake somebody's hand, because in many Western societies, right, shaking hand, and many societies period, shaking hands is a sort of basic gesture you do towards other human beings to say like, hey human, I'm a human too. But he was making assumptions that if somebody was refusing a handshake, they meant something terrible by it, when from her perspective, as she expressed in court, that's really not what she meant at all. It had to do with religious beliefs, and she tried to do it in the least offensive way possible. In fact, she put her hand over her heart instead as a way of sort of acknowledging him. So it's a good example of people that we sometimes make assumptions about people without fully understanding their backgrounds and what maybe their behaviors and ideas mean in their context. We also make assumptions about other groups of people as a whole, so not just individuals from other cultures, but entire communities, entire cultures that we may not be from. A very, very tragic example of this happened with what is known as the Massacre at Wounded Knee, where approximately 300 indigenous Americans were killed, were slaughtered, really, at the Massacre at Wounded Knee in the late 1800s. There is a complex history there. I don't want to downplay the complexity of it on both sides, but part of what fed into this tragic event was that there was a misunderstanding on the part of some politicians and military leaders about a ceremonial movement, a religious movement called the ghost dance that was becoming very popular among some Native American groups at the time, including some Plains tribes, such as some of the Lakota groups. The ghost dance movement, to be brief, was what we sometimes call millenarian sort of religious movement, where it was sort of based on this idea that eventually there would come a day of sort of peace, where, in this case, the colonizers would be chased from, taken from, eliminated from the taking over of their lands, sort of a return to full sovereignty. However, when this dance, this collective dance, and these sorts of messages about colonizers were heard about by outsiders, they assumed that this was a military uprising rather than sort of a religious movement predicated on some sort of, future restoration by spiritual means of their territory. And so that is the interpretation of the ghost dance as a military uprising rather than a religious ceremony that's not all that different from a lot of other religious ceremonies with millenarian notions, led to a really horrific massacre. So sometimes the assumptions we make about other cultures can have deadly consequences. Sometimes the consequences are far less severe, but are still problematic, or maybe not an ideal situation, right? We'd all like to live in a society where people get their rights respected and where policy looks the way it should and people have their freedom and things look the way we want them to look as a community. People are respected. Sometimes we make assumptions about other groups of people that get in the way of sort of the best solutions, or maybe can kind of cloud our vision a little. I had you do a video that you watched called Living Dena'ina about Lime Village, a community over on the other side of Cook Inlet from here in Kenai Peninsula, predominantly Dena'ina village. So for those of us here in Kenai Peninsula, well, specifically this part of Kenai Peninsula, for those of you who live in Anchorage or Matsu, we live on the traditional homelands of Dena'ina people, or Dena'ina people, to say that more correctly or in line with certain dialects. So in that video, though, I want you to pay attention to the fact that this is an Alaskan community, right? An Alaskan Native community where subsistence fishing and subsistence hunting still plays a really prominent role in people's cultural practices. Part of the reason I wanted you to see that was just to show that, in an anthropology class, we're going to be talking a lot about cultures in New Guinea or Tibet or sort of all over the world, far off, distant locations. But I also want us to recognize that we have a lot of cultural diversity just right here in Alaska, right? 20 different Alaska Native languages, for example. But the other thing I want you to get out of that video is that people, even when cultures have changed a lot, when there's been huge historical change, such as Alaska becoming a state, such as the entrance of Europeans, such as the rise of industry, even when there's been huge changes, cultural traditions often still persist in interesting ways. They adapt, but they also persist. And that matters when we have conversations, for example, about things as Alaskans that we need to decide upon, like how should we set the fishing limits? Who should get what kind of fishing rights? What should the fishing limits overall be? How do we balance the needs of subsistence fishers, commercial fishers? Or for that matter, when we have discussions, as we recently are here on Kenai Peninsula, about oil development in our area. All of these sorts of things, and it's not to get political and say one is right or one is wrong. What I'm simply saying is that whatever our viewpoints, it's helpful to have correct understandings of the communities around us, because if we assume that communities have mostly all become just sort of part of the urban industrial system, we might approach some of these issues of fish sustainability as purely economic or environmental, right? What's the best for the economy? What's the best for the resource? But we have to also recognize, if we're having a clear view of other cultures, that these communities aren't gone, that have relied on these fish, right? And that there are cultural attachments there and cultural practices there. And we have to take those into account when we think about how we're going to kind of make sure our resources get respected here in Alaska. And that's true not just of Alaska Native communities, I should hasten to add, but of other communities in Alaska from a variety of backgrounds. Some of the Euro-American communities, some of the Asian American communities, a variety of different cultures here in Alaska who rely really heavily on subsistence. So that has to be a kind of a part of the equation. But if we assume that people no longer do subsistence hunting or fishing in Alaska, we'd obviously be wrong, right? And we'd be missing an important piece of the puzzle when we think about policy. We also make assumptions about our own people. So I had you do a reading called Body Ritual Among the Nakarima, and if you haven't done that reading yet, please go do it now. Okay, I'm paused dramatically, so hopefully now you've done it. Body Ritual Among the Nakarima was an article written in the 1950s by an anthropologist by the name of Horace Minor. And you can tell he's a good anthropologist because he's from University of Michigan. Just kidding, that's a little anthropology joke that wouldn't make sense to anybody other than me. Anyways, in Body Ritual Among the Nakarima, he talks about a group of people that he studied that have all sorts of bizarre rituals to try to prolong and perfect their health, including mouth priests that go and shove plants into their mouth, and places where they have to ceremonially disrobe in large buildings where people often die. And it probably occurred to you as you were going through this article, you probably eventually realized that what Horace Minor was doing was he was being satirical and poking a little bit of fun at Americans, or rather Americans in the 1950s, right? He was poking fun at dentists. Us going to the dentist, right? Because, of course, this is totally normal, right? A bunch of people putting sharp implements into your mouth. That's not weird at all. Or the fact that we have to get naked, right? In doctor's offices or hospitals. He's poking fun at that. But also making an important point. By the way, Nakarima, spelled backwards. American, obviously. Took me, I think, 2 or 3 times of reading it, actually, to realize that. But anyways, it's meant to be silly. But it's also meant to make a profound point. Everyone's culture looks strange to the people outside of that culture, at least sometimes, right? At least some of your practices are going to be specific to your culture and are going to look odd to people outside of that culture. And so that is true, but at the same time, they make sense to you, right? They make sense in your context. And so we can't sort of judge practices. We sometimes make assumptions about ourselves that sort of we're normal, we do normal things, and yet don't realize that to outsiders, some of the things that we do in our own communities and cultures are equally strange to folks outside them as we may think their practices are. And so we'll talk about that a lot through the course. There's an old saying from Ruth Benedict, a famous anthropologist, that the goal of anthropology is to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar, to help us make sense of cultures that might seem different, very different from us, but also to help us see that our own culture can look kind of bizarre from an outsider's perspective, and to give us a little bit of humility to recognize that there's not sort of just one way to human. Now I want you to think for a second, what assumptions do you make? And I really do want you to think about that, so much so that I want you to write it down. And I really want you to do that. So do that. Pause. Okay, great. Dramatic pause accomplished. Now that we've thought about our assumptions, a point I want to make is that how we think about people, the assumptions we make about ourselves, about others, about other groups, other cultures, these matter. These matter greatly. They matter in our careers. So for example, I often have students that are going into medical fields, how you think about other people's cultural beliefs, right? That might affect what kind of medical care you can give, or if you're familiar with the cultural beliefs of the people who you're treating. As we saw in the reading that you did about anthropologists that were playing a role in helping with the Ebola epidemic in West Africa in 2014, right? There were medical practitioners who weren't fully aware of some of the cultural intricacies there, and also just of how they were being perceived and how their actions were being perceived by locals. There was some social stuff going on the ground that, you know, because the medical professionals were heavily focused on what they are exceptional at, right, preventing disease, and they were doing things that made logical sense to them, such as really quick burials to not be spreading disease, or things that made sense from a medical perspective, but things which were very offensive from a cultural perspective. So sometimes if we're not thinking about other people's cultures, or maybe if we misunderstand them, that can cause negative ramifications in our careers. But the flip side of that is we have lots and lots and lots of good research in anthropology and in all sorts of other fields to say that when medical professionals do have knowledge of the culture of the people they're working with, when psychologists and psychiatrists have understanding of the cultural backgrounds of their patients, when journalists have understanding of the cultures of the groups that they're writing about, that helps them be better at their jobs. How we think about human beings affects our relationships. Of course, the assumptions we make about others are going to affect that, and it's both relationships with people in our own group, but also relationships with our coworkers, acquaintances, family members, friends who are from communities other than our own. How we think about people matters in our public policy, as we were just talking about. Kind of an odd, interesting example with fishing law in multiple different ways is affected by the assumptions we make about people. The fact that we have things like this private property, no trespassing sign, right, is kind of built on an assumption that people, strangers are potentially a danger and they need to stay away from our property. So that's an assumption, and it affects how we do policy and how we think about land ownership. I'm not saying it's a wrong assumption. I'm not saying any of these are wrong assumptions, but they are assumptions and they affect policy. How we think about people affects our education system, right? The ways that we teach about things like how the economy works, how psychology works, things like that are affected by how well we understand the people around us. And it affects, of course, how we view ourselves. There are certain discourses about human beings in our society which I would argue are very optimistic. There are some that are rather pessimistic, and we'll talk about some of those in this class. For example, we'll talk about the assumption that human beings are fundamentally sort of chaotic if they don't have a government stepping in to tell them what to do, or that humans are fundamentally greedy if there's not proper property policies put in place. And we'll see that although that may certainly be the case for modern Americans, right, if there was sort of a complete absence overnight of our legal and political structure, it probably would be very chaotic, very much so. It's not the case that every human society has required formal government or formal laws to respect each other's rights and use resources sustainably. In fact, it has often been the case that that hasn't been this way. So how we think about people then matters in just about anything. Do you interact with people in your job? How you think about people matters. But are our ideas about people actually right? Sometimes definitely, and sometimes not so much. I probably, like many of you, have made assumptions about people which afterwards turned out to be very incorrect, right? Very wrong. So are our ideas about people actually right? Well, that leads us into the learning objectives for today. I'm going to pause the video there, though. This has been going on long enough, I think, and I like to kind of break these videos into digestible chunks for a variety of reasons, one of which is if you've got a bad internet connection so that you're not sort of buffering till the end of all time. Also, just it can be handy if you're, just trying to listen on the way to work or something. Anyways, I like to do smaller video chunks, so I'm going to pause it here and then we'll go on.